It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this virtual Taiwan lecture on Chinese studies. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Crater River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I believe that this is especially fitting considering that the topic of today's lecture relates to Indigenous peoples, in this case, the Indigenous peoples of Taiwan. On behalf of the Cheong-Yi-Tong Extension Library of the University of Toronto, I'd like to welcome you to the Taiwan Lecture on Chinese Studies, which is sponsored by the National Central Library of Taiwan. Thank you for joining us on this special occasion. This event is part of the Taiwan Resource Center for Chinese Studies, TRCCS program, under our partnership with the National Central Library of Taiwan. In 2015, the University of Toronto Libraries had the pleasure to host the first TRCCS in Canada. This is just the latest milestone within the framework of our long-standing cooperation with the National Central Library of Taiwan for research, teaching, and learning about Taiwan's history and culture at the University of Toronto. In 2020, this partnership has been renewed to enable even further collaboration. This program runs a series of Taiwan lectures on Chinese studies, presenting new sinological scholarship and facilitating further academic exchange between Taiwan and Canada. Today, our invited speaker, Dr. Awi Moona, who is Associate Professor of Law and Indigenous Studies at the National Donghua University, and also Director of the Research Center for Indigenous Education at the National Academy for Educational Research. We speak about national apology and reinvigoration of Indigenous rights in Taiwan. Dr. Awi Moona is a legal scholar dedicated to the research and the development of Indigenous movements and legal systems. He is the first Indigenous person in Taiwan to obtain a PhD in law. His degree is from the University of Washington School of Law. He specializes in the areas of Indigenous law, Aboriginal title law, and cultural and education law. He is a member of the CIDIC, Indigenous People, and is committed to developing national laws that advance the rights and interests of Taiwan's Indigenous peoples. Professor Awi Moona will share his insights on Indigenous rights and how Taiwanese laws impact Indigenous communities by focusing on the essential characteristics of Indigenous justice in Taiwan under successive alien regimes. Before we invite Dr. Awi Moona to proceed with his talk, we have two special congratulatory remarks for this event. First, I'm honored to introduce the Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, Toronto, Catherine Xu. Secondly, following Ms. Xu, our own Professor Tong Nam, Director of the Global Taiwan Studies Program in Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, will also share his congratulatory remarks. Finally, I'd like to extend our great appreciation to the National Central Library for sponsoring us to make this wonderful event possible. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the special lecture today.
I'm honored to offer my greeting on behalf of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Toronto. I'd like to thank Director Hannah Kim and her team at the East Asian Library of the University of Toronto for hosting this TRCCS lecture event in collaboration with the National Central Library in Taiwan. I also like to welcome and thank Dr. Awi Moona from the National Donghua University in Taiwan for sharing his extremely informative and inspiring lecture with us. Our government has endeavored to recognize and restore the right of our indigenous people in recent decades, but more can be done. Taiwan and Canada share many commonalities in this regard, so I thank you for this meaningful event, which offers a great opportunity for us to reflect and learn from each other. I hope everyone enjoys it.
I'm really excited that the East Asian Library at the University of Toronto is having Dr. Awi Moona, the Director and Professor of Law and Indigenous Studies in Taiwan's National Donghua University, as the speaker of this event. Dr. Awi, who received his PhD at the University of Washington, is the first Indigenous person in Taiwan to obtain a PhD in law. His research primarily focused on the area of Indigenous law, of original title law, as well as cultural and educational law. Although the importance of listening to the voices of the indigenous people has been acknowledged, by and large, scholarship on empire and the critique of settler colonialism are still mostly done by non-indigenous people. So it is really important to have indigenous people not as native informant, but as knowledge producer themselves. Dr. Awi Moona's academic accomplishment has exemplified such a possibility. Also, as Dr. Awi's talk has demonstrated, Taiwan is an important site to study indigeneity and law, especially due to its multiple historical layers of settler colonialism. Here in Canada, much like Taiwan, the issue of rights, social justice, and the livelihood of the indigenous peoples have not yet been fully addressed. So I really hope that Professor Awi's lecture on transnational justice will inspire us not just to think deeper, but also to begin to address the historical and systematic issues that the indigenous people in Canada and around the world are facing.
I'm very glad, and it's my honor to present here today to talk to you about the indigenous peoples in Taiwan. It's my pleasure to be here to talk to the peoples and friends in University of Toronto about the indigenous peoples' rights in Taiwan. And my talk will focus on the national apology and after the apology, what has happened and what have been brought to the reinvigoration of indigenous rights in Taiwan. And right now, I am the director and associate professor of law and indigenous studies at National Donghua University in the eastern Taiwan, where is the city of Hualien. Also, I'm leading the Legal Aid Foundation on Indigenous branch as a director. Before I start my talk today, as an Indigenous peoples, I would like to say some greetings on my Indigenous languages. Sentamas balai, Awi Moona ga hangamu, ga kurigruba ga alamu, which means I bring my warmest greetings to all of my friends in Canada, especially at University of Toronto. And I introduce myself as Awi Moona, and that is my indigenous name. And also my hometown is the Alang Gruba. And on the screen, you can see two pictures. The old one, the black one, is our village back in the 1930s during the Japanese occupation. And on the color one, it is the current village views. So I think since we are going to talk about the indigenous peoples in Taiwan, it is very important. And then I show you a general idea about the indigenous peoples. And this is the traditional locations roughly that we can refer to the indigenous peoples back in the early 20th centuries. So in the central part and especially on the eastern part of Taiwan, that's what we call the official recognized indigenous peoples right now. And on the western side, the Plains area, that's what we call the Plains indigenous peoples. Taiwan's indigenous peoples, based on the academic research, we belong to Austronesian linguistic family. And we have a variety of languages and cultures. Before the immigration of Han Chinese in the 17th centuries, indigenous peoples have lived in Taiwan for a long time. So from the historical record, it shows is roughly about the 1620s that when the Dutch and the Spaniards came to Taiwan and set up these settlements. And right now we have the 16 officially recognized indigenous nations. And the total indigenous population is about 580,000 populations, which accounting for 2.3% of the Taiwan population. So you can see the population ratio is that not that big, but the ratio is probably very similar to the Canadian First Nations population compared to the total Canadian populations. We all roughly occupy 2% of the populations. And on the other hand, the Pingpu peoples are also identified as part of the Austronesian linguistic families. As they live by the sea, if you can see the map showing on the western plains area of Taiwan, they have to face the impact of political, economic, linguistic, cultural, and other forces from a large number of people coming in outside of Taiwan, such as the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Han Chinese. Unfortunately, they have failed to resist their fate to be assimilated starting from 17th centuries. By the end of 19th centuries, most Pingpu tribes have been almost completed Hanist. So that's the very, very basic idea introduction of Taiwan's indigenous peoples, which means in Taiwan right now we can say there are two sets of indigenous peoples. One is officially recognized, and another is unrecognized but to be recognized, like the Pingpu indigenous nations. So in terms of the indigenous rights movement, I think it is very important I bring you back to the historical backgrounds and interactions between the indigenous peoples and the coming colonial regimes. So on this graph, you can see there is identifications from the government side into identifying how do we understand indigenous peoples. But each different period used by the different colonial regimes with different terms. There was an untold story hidden behind these names has been used. Today we are using indigenous peoples constitutionally, legally, and socially. But the term of indigenous peoples began to be used only starting 1994 onward. The reason for that is before that, post-World War II, starting from 1945 through 1994, the Republic of China, Taiwan government identified the so-called indigenous peoples with the term mountain compatriots. So what I'm trying to say is indigenous peoples is the term we ourselves choose to be named. So that is an idea to show indigenous people have right to be self-determination. So before 1994, we were identified as mountain compatriots, which means we are culturally inferior. And I will bring to you that later. And before World War II, especially during the Japanese occupation, even from the first contact until to pre-1930s, we have encountered different colonial regimes, but most these colonial regimes use the idea of savages to see indigenous peoples. So the impact with these names is very, very similar to the Western colonial world when they encountered indigenous peoples in the continent of America, in the continent of Australia, even in New Zealand. Those ideas is used by the conceptualizing others by the colonial regimes. And based on the international law, we see this conceptualization of others was based on the idea of doctrine of discovery and conquest. Because those colonial regimes, they all saw indigenous land as terra nullius, which means no man's land. And as this doctrine of discovery period, and then we have to face the imperialism, which has been brought about by the colonialisms. And up to the 20th centuries, the indigenous people has to face another colonial impact, which has been identified as cultural colonialisms. So the impact of these conceptualizations and its influence brought upon the indigenous peoples, I will identify them as an idea of progress. Through this idea of progress, where then we can come to a conclusion that the dispossession of indigenous peoples, both on lands and rights. So how do we understand this idea of progress? This idea of progress, we can divide it into three different phases. Phase one is the colonial regime started the denigration of indigenous cultures. After this denigration of indigenous cultures, then the colonial regime can assert they are or they were racially and culturally superior to indigenous peoples. After these two phases, and then the government will start the stigmatizations of indigenous cultural differences. So after these three different phases, and then we, or as a colonial regime, as a government, they can set up a legally structure which can dominate the relationship with the indigenous peoples. And that's what I said. After these phases, the government can complete the so-called dispossession of indigenous rights and indigenous lands. It's not only happened in Taiwan, but also across the globe, especially in the continent of America, North America. So what I'm trying to share with you in my first part of the talk is that I quote from the official apology issued by our President Chih-Wei on 2016, August 1st. She said, Taiwan is known as a culturally diverse society, but even today, indicators on health, education, economic livelihood, political participation, and more still show gaps between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples. Meanwhile, stereotype and even discrimination against indigenous people have not gone away. So this is an apology issued on 2016, but the content has shown the indigenous people have already endeavors to conquer since the 17th century until now. But how this structure can be such as legally strengthened, and then that's why I have already talked to you about what has been happened historically and how does different colonial regime interact with indigenous peoples. And then some of the map I'm trying to show you here is how indigenous people has been dispossessed by different colonial regimes. So the first one is the end of Qing. On the map, especially in the central of Taiwan, that word says that's the Sheng Fan Di, which means that called by the Qing Empire as the Rose Savages territory. And in Mandarin, that we call Sheng Fan Di. In the current understanding, that means indigenous people's territory. And on the next one, the central part has been blank, showing there is nothing there. So when the Japanese government came to Taiwan, it started to dispossess indigenous land through different tools, especially by laws and regulations. And up to the middle period of Japanese occupation, the Japanese colonial government started to set up the colonial administration in the central part and in the eastern part of Taiwan. That was where indigenous people's traditional territory were. And post-World War II, the Republic of China Taiwan government did not return indigenous land back to the indigenous people. They just replaced Republic of China's administration with the colonial administration set up in Japanese period. So if we use the idea of the indigenous traditional territory with different indigenous nations, if on the screen you can show on the right side, and it shows the 16 indigenous tribal traditional territory. That's almost the 70% of the Taiwan. But legally speaking, indigenous land right now has the legally recognition is only the reserved land for indigenous peoples, is shrink down to only 260,000 hectares, is a lot less than the traditional territory. So having said the historical background, just like the Canadian First Nations, we all fought for our rights to the government. So what indigenous people had responded to these successive governmental dispositions. So it is worth to mention internationally, indigenous rights movement roughly start after the United Nations has completed the first comprehensive study of the problem of discrimination against indigenous populations. And that study was conducted by the special rapporteur back then. The name is Jose Martinez Cobo. And he completed this study in 1986. And that also launched the International Indigenous Rights Movement. And similar period also has brought influence to indigenous peoples in Taiwan. So it's generally speaking, indigenous rights movement, I would call it the first wave of indigenous rights movement, starting from 1980s to 1990s. And this period has come to result of constitutional reforms. And we incorporate the indigenous article in the Republic of China constitutions. And the second wave of indigenous rights start, I would say, is between year 2000 through year 2005. Because during this period, the then ruling party government has signed officially with Taiwan indigenous peoples a new partnership treaty. And even the then President Chen Shui-bian has officially declared the Taiwan government has a nation-to-nation relationship with the indigenous peoples. So with these two political documents, which set up a very good foundation for indigenous rights movement. So which brings us to the third wave of indigenous rights movement, which is started from 2005 through 2016. The most prominent success during this period is the legislature in Taiwan enact indigenous people's basic law as the legal foundations. After that, we launched a series of indigenous legal construction almost into every aspect of indigenous rights. And we are, I would say, we are in the fourth wave of indigenous rights movement, starting from 2016, specifically speaking, after our President Chih-Wei delivered the national apology to indigenous peoples. So what we are focused right now on indigenous rights movement is we have to build up our indigenous rights claim based on indigenous historical justice and transitional justice. So what we have been observed is that the indigenous rights transform from the idea of equal protection and anti-discrimination of individual rights. We are on our way towards indigenous self-determination and self-government. And under this structure, under these indigenous rights development structures, we introduced a new legal paradigm onto the actualization or realization of indigenous rights. And based on this new legal paradigm, we actualize and or we legalize the indigenous legal traditions. In another term, we would say is customary law. So we legalize the customary laws. And the third one is under this structure, we label up indigenous rights as constitutional protected, which can be understood as the Article 35 of the 1982 Canadian Constitutions. Because like the Article 32 of the Canadian Constitutions, the articles say indigenous rights are hereby recognized and affirmed. And after this full wave of indigenous movement, we are also trying to level up Taiwan indigenous rights protection into the Constitution entrenched. However, the first indigenous rights advocate organization was established 36 years ago. And as I mentioned earlier, the Constitution first revised on indigenous rights is on the issue of we changed the term Sanbao to 原住民 23 years ago. And Indigenous Peoples Basic Law has been enacted. It's already 15 years. This number shows that how long we have continued to fight, to make claims indigenous rights. But some of the issues are still remained. The most important issue is return indigenous land, is return indigenous traditional territory. So those pictures showing on the screen says that starting in 1980s on the first wave of indigenous movement, we already claimed the government should return our land. Up until now, this issue is still unresolved. It still remains on the core claims of indigenous rights movement. So we still have a long way to go. If we compare to what has happened in Canada on First Nations, how First Nations claim their land back, I think that's the similar experience we indigenous people shared internationally. So other than that, we still can see there is an emerging and involvement of indigenous rights. But just like I said, we are in the fourth wave of indigenous rights movement. The major thing right now is we have to correct the past wrongs. We have to correct the successive colonial regimes because they identify indigenous peoples as savage peoples. The savage people means culturally, politically, economically, educationally, any term you can imagine, we are all identified as inferior to the dominant society. But culture has no differences. We cannot judge culture as superior or inferior. So all the dispossessions of indigenous rights are based on the identifications from the colonial regimes because they see indigenous people as inferior, which cannot be a rights holder to support to be a right holder or to be a right subject. So those ideas, those interpretations are just wrong. So right now we have to correct those past wrongs, but those past wrongs has colonial legal thoughts. So how can we conquer those colonial legal thoughts? We have to bring the historical justice and transitional justice to revise the colonial legal thoughts. So that is the first step. That is the first thing right now we are trying to claim. And the second one is the major thing of indigenous jurisprudence in Taiwan to regulate indigenous rights is we are trying to substantiate the idea of multiculturalism and the idea of substantive equality. And after these two phases, and then we are moving on to the rights of self-government and self-determination on indigenous jurisprudence. So what we have seen for the past few years on indigenous rights camps, to name a few, like we were originally recognized only 9 different indigenous nations, and right now we have 16 indigenous nations has been officially recognized. We are on the way toward the completion of indigenous education system. We have set up a mechanism to practice free, prior, and informed consent. And we have a regulation to require to make government obliged to consult and obtain indigenous tribal consent and participation whenever government or the private entity are trying to conduct land development on indigenous land area. Also, we are on the process to the legitimization of indigenous legal traditions. And we also have an implementations of cultural manifestations, expressions, and practices. In the judicial practices, we have already set up indigenous ad hoc tribunal to deal indigenous claims, lawsuits. And to support indigenous legal claims, we have set up an indigenous legal aid centers. We will have indigenous lawyer. We also have a lawyer who equipped with indigenous cultural competency to support indigenous lawsuits. So those are some of the examples we have advanced for the past few years on indigenous rights movement. So come to our conclusion today. I think the idea is national apology and reinvigoration. Why I want to use reinvigoration? Because for a long time, even indigenous ourselves has thought about the rights are individual based. So even on the first wave, on the second wave of indigenous rights movement, people were thinking, how can we protect individual indigenous rights in every social development area, politically, culturally, socially, education, health, and so on. But since 2008, we have seen the Australian Prime Minister deliver Australian national apology to Aboriginal peoples in Australia. After Australia, we also think the Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper back then also delivered a national apology to Canadian First Nation because the residential school impact. So from these two countries' national apology, what we have seen is indigenous rights are not individualized based. We have to see beyond individual conceptualization of rights. So on 2016, August 1st, when our President Chih-Wei issued a national apology to indigenous peoples, what we have seen is the apology is not item target. What I said is not specifically item issue target. The apology is towards every aspect on the relationship between indigenous peoples in Taiwan and successive colonial regimes. So the apology has told the general public in Taiwan, we have to create a new idea. We have to reconceptualize the indigenous rights in Taiwan, which can connect to the root of the land of Taiwan, that's why I use the idea we are doing the reinvigoration of indigenous rights. We are looking beyond the individualized rights. So, but it is very important we come to the national apology in Taiwan. The president has expressed that I know that even now there are some around us who see no need to apologize. But that is the most important reason why I am representing the government to issue this apology today. The following two sentences is what I see the core idea of the apology. These two paragraphs says that to see what was unfair in the past as a matter of course, or to treat the pain of other ethnic peoples as an unavoidable part of human development. This is the first mindset that we, standing here today, resolve to change and overturn. So why people will see what was unfair in the past as a matter of general course? In what kind of situation we will treat the pain of other people as an unavoidable part of human development? I said in the very beginning, the different colonial regimes in Taiwan, they saw we indigenous people as savages. And this idea of savages, from the point of view of colonial regime, has different levels, like raw savages, which means the most fierce savages. We also have been identifying some of the people as cooked savages, which means they are, to some extent, has been assimilated into the dominant society, but before they officially assimilated, integrated into the dominant society, before that happened, we are still savages. We just have raw or cooked different levels. And by having this in mind, then we might come to an understanding why people will think what was unfair in the past as a matter of general course. Why the people will treat the pain of others as an unavoidable part of human development. Because they already see indigenous peoples as a disaster, tragedy of the human society by seeing us, indigenous peoples in Taiwan, as inferior savage peoples. Because they have those mindset, so they will see Unfair is a general matter, of course. The pain of others as an unavoidable part of human development. That's why on the national apology issued by our president, she said, this is the first mindset we have to change, we have to overturn. Until this has happened, then we cannot overturn, we cannot complete the apology. So based on what I have been shared, I think there's another thing I would like to talk about is a lot of time, not only in Taiwan, I think it will be same in Canada. Indigenous people have long been identified or recognized as disadvantaged minority people or disadvantaged minority ethnic group. But how do we deal with minority issues? We use a tool, a legal tool or political tool, affirmative action, or the government can adopt affirmative measures to achieve the equality, the socialization of equality. But if we see indigenous people as disadvantaged minority, then we will ignore or we will miss the core claims made by indigenous peoples. So we have to truly understand what is the nature or essence of indigenous differences from the non-indigenous peoples. Because we have to come to an understanding the indigenous people's difference guarantee the constitutional protection of indigenous rights, which is not just a minority issue, which can be achieved by the distribution of resources. Because whenever we talk about disadvantaged minority peoples, a lot of time we see these minority people have poverty issues. They all have the allocation of resources. So if we can redistribute, reallocate resources onto different disadvantaged minority aspects, and then we can resolve the minority disadvantage through the affirmative actions. But then we will definitely ignore, we will definitely miss the indigenous differences. Like why the indigenous peoples can make a claim to self-government. Why the indigenous peoples can make claim to traditional territorial lands. These two core claims are truly the nature and essence of indigenous rights, and we can differentiate ourselves from minority issues. That is also the reason why, like the United Nations Organization of American States, are always urged the member states do not misunderstood the differences between indigenous peoples and minority peoples. And how can we conquer and how can we achieve the idea of the multiculturalism? For me, I think the idea or the realization of multiculturalism has a triple concentric structures for the maintenance and operation. In the inner circle, we have to guarantee each indigenous nation enjoys substantially equal and completely effective self-government. In the middle circle, we have to understand the importance of legitimization of sui generis rights and its full realization for indigenous peoples. And in the outer ring, we have to recognize and manifestation of multiculturalism as constitutional value. If we fulfill the inner circle, middle circle, and then we will represent the idea of the multiculturalism as a constitutional values. So in another simple way, what does multiculturalism means to indigenous peoples? In the very beginning, I introduced to you that indigenous people occupy 2% of the total population in Taiwan. But how can we achieve the idea of multiculturalism? How can we achieve indigenous rights movement? The core value of indigenous historical justice and transitional justice, we have to make the 98% towards the 2%. Because I believe the full circle represents the 100%. The full circle means 100%. And it will be achieved if the 98% can recognize the 2%. If the 98% can move towards the recognition and realization of indigenous rights, and then we will have a full circles. I think that's the idea and the value we have to cherish, not only in Taiwan, but also in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, in the United States, in every place where has indigenous peoples. So I think this concludes my presentation today. And I thank you very much for your attention and participation. I will use my own languages to say my last words. Mukwash Balai. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in the near future. Thank you.